She didn't look like a monster. That's the first thing you need to understand. She was described as breathtakingly beautiful. Pale skin, dark eyes, raven hair. The kind of woman that painters would beg to capture and poets would ruin themselves trying to describe. And she knew it. She had always known it. Beauty was her power, her currency, her armor, and she was terrified of losing it. So terrified that she did something so extreme, so ritualistic, so deliberately cruel that when the story finally broke, when the investigators arrived and the castle doors were forced open, the people who had heard the rumors for years still weren't prepared for what they found. Her name was Elizabeth Báthory. She was a countess. She was one of the most powerful noblewomen in 16th century Hungary. And according to the testimony of more than 300 witnesses, she murdered somewhere between 80 and 650 young women, bathed in their blood, and believed, genuinely, obsessively believed, that it was keeping her young. But here's what the story never tells you. Elizabeth Báthory wasn't just a killer. She was a product of a world where noble blood meant absolute power, where women had no protection from the aristocracy, where the church looked away, where the crown looked away, where everyone looked away for decades while the screaming continued inside the castle walls. And when they finally stopped looking away, it wasn't because they cared about the girls. Drop a comment with your city and country, because what you're about to hear isn't just the story of a monster. It's the story of a system that built her, and once you see how, you'll never look at the legend the same way again. Elizabeth Báthory was born in 1560 in the Kingdom of Hungary into one of the most powerful noble families in Central Europe. The Báthorys weren't just wealthy, they were dynastically embedded in the political fabric of the region in a way that made them almost untouchable. Her uncle was the King of Poland, her cousin was the Prince of Transylvania. Her family had produced military commanders, political leaders, and church officials for generations. She was, from the moment of her birth, surrounded by absolute power. But the Báthory family had another legacy, one that was whispered about rather than recorded in official documents. A strain of something darker running through the bloodline. Mental illness, epilepsy, explosive, violent behavior. Her uncle Gabor was known for devil worship. Her brother Istvan was a sexual predator. Her aunt Clara was a torturer of servants who took pleasure in cruelty the way other women took pleasure in embroidery. Elizabeth was raised in this world. She watched this behavior. She absorbed what she saw. And at 14 years old, she was married off to Ferenc Nadasdy, a Hungarian military commander, 10 years her senior, in a match arranged for political alliance, not affection. Think about that age, 14, the same age Elagabalus was when he became Emperor of Rome, the same age at which children throughout history were handed adult power they had no framework to use responsibly. Elizabeth didn't become empress. She became the mistress of Csejte Castle. But in 16th century Hungary, for a noblewoman of her rank, that was its own kind of absolute authority. And Ferenc was almost never home. He was a military commander, one of the most celebrated military figures of his era, known as the Black Knight of Hungary, famous for his campaigns against the Ottoman Empire. He was away for months at a time, sometimes years, and Elizabeth was left alone in that castle, with the servants, with the peasants on her land, with the absolute power of the Hungarian nobility, and with no one, or the will, to question what she did. The records show that the cruelty started early. Servants who displeased her were punished in ways that went far beyond anything that could be called discipline. Beatings so severe they left permanent damage, pins driven under fingernails. Girls dragged outside in winter and drenched with cold water until they froze to death, ice forming over their bodies while Elizabeth watched from a window. She bit pieces of flesh from the faces and arms of girls who angered her, tearing at them with her teeth the way an animal tears at prey. Where were the authorities? The answer is exactly what you'd expect from a society built on aristocratic privilege. She was nobility. The girls she was torturing were peasants and servants. They were, in the eyes of the law, essentially property. Their suffering wasn't invisible. Neighbors knew, local priests knew, community members talked, but talking and acting are different things. Ferenc knew too, saw what was happening in his household, and said nothing that mattered. The castle absorbed the screaming, the walls kept their secrets, and Elizabeth kept practicing. Then, in 1604, Ferenc Nadasti died. He was 48 years old, and with his death, the last social restraint on Elizabeth Báthory disappeared entirely. She was 44 years old, a widow, and according to everyone who described her in this period, she was becoming obsessed with something that many powerful women of her era feared. She was aging. The mirror was telling her things she refused to hear. The skin that had once been described as porcelain perfect was changing. A servant girl was brushing Elizabeth's hair and made a mistake. She pulled too hard, or tangled a knot, or committed some minor imperfection in her service. Elizabeth struck her, hard enough to draw blood. The girl's blood landed on Elizabeth's hand, and when Elizabeth wiped it away, she looked at the skin beneath and became convinced, absolutely convinced, that the skin where the blood had touched was smoother, younger, more radiant than the skin around it. Blood was considered powerful, life-giving, transformative. Elizabeth had spent 44 years watching people around her die or be destroyed by age and time. She had absolute power over her servants. She had no oversight, no accountability, no one to tell her no. And she had just convinced herself that she had found the secret. What followed was no longer torture with a thin justification of discipline. It became something systematic, deliberate, organized. She needed girls, young ones. She reasoned, or convinced herself, that youth was the property of young blood. She began bathing in it, immersing herself, having servants drain the blood of young women into a wooden tub so she could sit in it and feel the youth seeping back into her aging body. To acquire them, she and her small circle of accomplices, a wet nurse named Anna Darvulia, a manservant named Janos Fixko, and two servants named Dorotia Sentes and Ilona Yo, developed a system. They would advertise positions at the castle as domestic work, appealing to poor peasant families with the promise of honest wages and a roof over their daughters' heads. The families sent their girls. They trusted the Countess. They believed their daughters were going to work. They were never coming home. The girls were locked in the castle. The torture began immediately. The blood rituals followed. And when a girl died, which happened with regularity, which happened inevitably, the body had to be disposed of. Sometimes they were buried in local churchyards with invented causes of death, and local communities started to notice. Young women who had gone to work for the Countess were disappearing. The families asked questions. The priests noted the deaths. But the Countess was nobility, and nobody acted. Nobody acted for years. Then Elizabeth made a mistake. For most of her killing career, her victims had been peasants and servants, women from the lowest rungs of Hungarian society. Their disappearances were grievous and real, but they were also easier for the powerful to ignore. But as the years passed and the obsession deepened, Elizabeth's circle began recruiting from higher social classes. She began accepting daughters of lesser noble families into her castle, under the pretense of teaching them social graces, court etiquette, the manners and arts expected of noble women. These weren't peasant girls with no protection. These were girls whose families had names, families who knew people, families who, when their daughters vanished, had access to ears that listened. The complaints began reaching Georg Thurzo, the Palatine of Hungary, essentially the second most powerful man in the kingdom, after the king himself. He had heard the rumors. Everyone had heard the rumors. But now the rumors had noble names attached to them, and that changed everything. Notice what it took. Decades of murdered peasant girls changed nothing. The moment minor nobility was touched, the machinery of justice finally began to move. Hold that thought. We'll come back to it. On December 29th, 1610, Thurzo arrived at Csejte Castle with a group of armed men. They had a warrant. They had witnesses. They had testimony from survivors and from people who had seen what happened inside those walls. What they found when they broke through the doors was worse than the testimony had prepared them for. A girl was dead in the main hall. Another was dying. Others were locked in the dungeon, some wounded, some in states of starvation and shock. The evidence of what had been happening there, the instruments, the records, the sheer accumulated evidence of years of systematic murder was overwhelming. Elizabeth Báthory was arrested that night. The trial that followed produced testimony from more than 300 witnesses. The accounts were consistent in their horror. Testimony described the torture methods in clinical detail: the bathing in blood, the biting, the burning, the freezing. One servant testified that she had personally kept a register, a ledger of the victims, and that the total number recorded in Elizabeth's own handwriting was 650. The number is disputed by modern historians, who believe the actual death toll may have been lower, perhaps 80 to 100. But even 80 is a number that staggers the imagination. Even 80 means 80 families who sent their daughters to that castle and waited for them to come home. But here is the part of this story that history tends to skip past, the part that matters as much as the horror itself. Elizabeth Báthory was never tried. She was never brought before a court. She never faced a judge or a jury or a public proceeding where the evidence was formally presented and a verdict formally rendered. King Matthias II wanted her tried and executed. He wanted her head. But Georg Thurzo opposed it. And the reason Thurzo opposed it tells you everything about what this case was actually about. If Elizabeth Báthory were tried publicly, all of her estates and assets would be legally forfeit. Everything she owned would be seized. And Elizabeth Báthory owned an enormous amount. She was, in fact, one of the primary creditors to the Hungarian crown itself. King Matthias owed her money. A public trial and execution meant those debts might be claimed by her heirs, or worse, might become a legal and political complication that nobody wanted to untangle. So instead, they made a deal. Her accomplices, the wet nurse, the manservant, the 2 female servants, were tried publicly. The women had their fingers torn off with hot pincers before being burned alive. The manservant was beheaded, then burned. Justice for the helpers. Brutal, public, theatrical justice. But Elizabeth herself was walled into a room in Csejte Castle. Literally. Masons came and bricked up the doors and windows of her chambers, leaving only a small slot through which food could be passed. No trial, no verdict, no execution. Just a room, 4 walls, and silence. She lived like that for 3.5 years. On August 21st, 1614, a guard looked through the food slot and saw Elizabeth Báthory lying face down on the floor. She was dead. She was 54 years old. There was no examination, no ceremony, no public acknowledgement. She was buried quickly, quietly, in a local church. Later, because locals objected to having her body in their community, she was moved to the Báthory family crypt, and the crown quietly resolved its financial complications. Now, 4 centuries later, the name Elizabeth Báthory has become something almost mythological: the Blood Countess, the most prolific female serial killer in recorded history, the real-life inspiration for vampire legends. For Dracula himself, Bram Stoker was familiar with the Hungarian noble families of this region, and some scholars believe the Báthory story seeped into his imagination in ways that shaped the novel that would define the vampire myth forever. But here is what the mythology obscures. Elizabeth Báthory was not unique. She was extreme. She was horrifying. She was a killer on a scale that is almost incomprehensible. But she was not unique in being a powerful person who treated those beneath her as less than human, who used the bodies of the powerless as instruments of their own obsession, who operated for decades without consequence because the system around them was designed to protect power rather than people. What made her possible wasn't madness alone. Madness alone doesn't kill 80 people. Madness alone doesn't run a systematic operation with accomplices and recruitment networks and body disposal strategies over multiple decades. What made her possible was the structure she existed within, the absolute authority of the nobility, the legal invisibility of peasant women, the willingness of everyone, neighbors, priests, local officials, the crown itself, to look away as long as the victims were the right kind of powerless. And when they finally stopped looking away, it wasn't justice that stopped her. It was financial inconvenience. Think about that. The girls died because the system didn't care about girls. Elizabeth was imprisoned rather than executed because the system cared deeply about money. The accomplices burned alive because the system needed a public show of justice without the cost of actually dispensing it. Everything about the way this case ended tells you exactly what the case was really about. And it was never about the girls. The bloodbaths themselves, did they work? Did Elizabeth Báthory actually believe she was getting younger? The evidence suggests yes. She believed it with the certainty of someone who had constructed an entire reality around a single, desperate idea. And that idea, that youth could be stolen, that beauty could be preserved through the suffering of others, that death could be held at bay if you were powerful enough and ruthless enough to demand it, is not as historically unusual as we'd like to think. Cleopatra bathed in donkey's milk. Mary Queen of Scots bathed in wine. Noblewomen across Europe applied lead-based cosmetics that slowly poisoned them in the pursuit of the pale, flawless skin that signaled youth and status. The hunger for eternal beauty, the refusal to surrender to age, the willingness to harm in the service of appearance. These weren't unique to Elizabeth Báthory. She was just willing to go further than anyone else, and she was positioned in a world that let her. The blood didn't work, of course. The skin absorbs some things and not others. Youth is not a property that transfers. Elizabeth Báthory aged. She wrinkled. She changed despite everything. And the girls she killed died for a delusion, a powerful woman's vanity taken to its absolute, catastrophic extreme. 3.5 years in that walled room, no light coming in, food passed through a slot, the woman who had presided over banquets and rituals, and the screaming of hundreds, now sitting in silence with only her thoughts for company. What did she think about in that room? Did she believe she had done wrong? The evidence suggests not. During the investigation, she was defiant. She refused to confess, refused to show remorse, dismissed the accusations with the contempt of someone who genuinely could not comprehend being held accountable. She was nobility. These were servants. The calculus of consequence had never applied to her before. But in that room, in the dark, with the years passing, and the food slot the only connection to a world that had decided to forget her, maybe the calculus shifted. Or maybe not. Maybe she sat in that room and remained convinced, to the end, that she had been wronged, that the girls were nothing, that the blood had been working, that if they had just let her continue, she would have found what she was looking for. We don't know. We can't know. The room didn't allow for confessions or revelations. It only allowed for disappearance. And disappearance, in the end, is what Elizabeth Báthory got instead of justice. Not a trial, not an execution, not accountability, just erasure. Walled in and forgotten, while the crown quietly sorted out its finances, and the families of 80 or 100 or 650 girls received nothing. No acknowledgement, no compensation, no name carved anywhere to say that their daughters had existed and had mattered. The Blood Countess is remembered because her story is spectacular, because the horror is cinematic, because the image of a beautiful noblewoman bathing in the blood of young girls is exactly the kind of image that survives 4 centuries of retelling. But the girls are not remembered, not individually, not by name, not in any monument or record that preserves them as people rather than victims. And that, more than the bloodbaths, more than the torture instruments, more than any detail of what happened inside Csejte Castle, is the darkest part of this story. She is the legend, they are the footnote, and the system that made that possible wasn't unique to 16th century Hungary. It is the oldest system in human history, the one that decides whose suffering counts and whose doesn't, based entirely on whose suffering is inconvenient to the powerful. Elizabeth Báthory didn't invent that system. She just used it completely, ruthlessly, and for longer than anyone should have been allowed. The castle still stands. Csejte Castle, in what is now Slovakia, sits on a hill above the village that once feared it. The walls are ruined now, open to the sky. The rooms that held so many secrets, emptied by centuries of weather and time. Tourists visit. They take photographs. They buy souvenirs of the Blood Countess, the beautiful monster, the vampire queen, the legend. The village below is quiet, and somewhere under the ground, in the places where the bodies were buried without ceremony or record, the girls who were nobody and nothing and worth less than a countess's financial debt to the crown are still waiting for someone to say their names. Nobody knows what those names were. That's the story they don't tell. That's what happened inside the castle walls. That's what beauty costs when power has no limit and accountability has no teeth. She bathed in blood to stay young. It didn't work. It never works. But she kept trying, and the world kept letting her. And by the time anyone decided to stop her, the price had already been paid by the only people in this story who didn't deserve to pay it.